What I discovered was reminded of, was all we have to do is ask. Ask God. He's the creative one. He's the creator of the universe, and he lives inside of each one of us. And he wants to help us. Such a basic principle, and yet so revolutionary. The way that the Lord will show up and meet a need that you could never have figured out how to meet on your own. That just really encouraged me and helped overcome some challenges.
Hi, you're listening to the Zan Tyler podcast.
When my husband and I decided to homeschool our children, one of the hardest decisions was choosing resources and curriculum. BJU Press Homeschool was the answer. My kids are drawn to the colorful illustrations and interesting facts. They look forward to their video lessons. The teachers are so creative and the special characters hold their attention. My youngest is a hands-on learner. Each of her subjects has engaging activities. The Bible and biblical principles are woven throughout the curriculum. It's not just a verse here and there. It's in the illustrations, the stories, the example problems. BJU Press has all the core subjects we need for kindergarten through 12th grade, and some fun electives too. They give me the freedom to choose what's best for each of my kids. A full grade kit with distance learning videos for one. For another, I'm going to teach most of the subjects and use videos just for math. BJU Press Homeschool has made it possible for me to be a wife, a mom, and an educator.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast. I'm your host, Zan Tyler. Today, we're going to be talking about gaps in our homeschooling. Every homeschool mom I've ever talked to is worried about gaps and how these gaps will affect their kids. So today, Nancy Manos and I are going to be discussing that, and we hope we're going to give you encouragement and information that will inspire you to homeschool with joy and confidence. So Nancy, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is going to be such a great discussion, such an important and timely conversation about gaps.
Right, because if we don't feel the weight of the gaps in homeschooling, we have lots of people in our lives that will give us gaps to worry about. I can remember when Joe and I first started homeschooling, everywhere I went, people would say, "What about the prom?" I mean, my kids are 6 and 4. What about the prom? What about PE? That was a big deal back in the day. What about physics? And it just would get me on this trajectory of worry. And it was like I'd set an alarm clock in my head. Every morning at 2, I would wake up and my mind would be going in 1,000 different directions with those conversations playing that I'd had throughout the day, with everybody telling me how much my kids were missing or how I couldn't fill the gaps in education or I couldn't educate them without gaps. So I can remember I used to wake up Joe every night in the middle of the night and talk to him about these things that were on my mind. And finally he said to me, "Hey, Zan, Jesus is always awake." And so it really hurt my feelings because he didn't want to talk to me at 2:00 in the morning, but it did change my prayer life. And Nancy, you said something about gaps that really means a lot to me.
So in our homeschool years, we homeschooled from preschool through high school. And what I discovered was reminded of, was all we have to do is ask. Ask God. He's the creative one. He's the creator of the universe, and he lives inside of each one of us, and he wants to help us. Like, it's such a basic principle, and yet so revolutionary. The way that the Lord will show up and meet a need that you could never have figured out how to meet on your own. And so that just really encouraged me and helped overcome some challenges.
I really do believe that as we homeschool, God is our superintendent of education. And
Yes.
We're really just co-laboring with the Holy Spirit as we seek to raise our kids to glorify Him, but also to have a fulfilling life where they can serve other people. So there are a couple of things I want to say about gaps as we start. And that is, every form of education has gaps. Gaps are not unique to homeschooling. I mean, there's no perfect school teacher in public, private, or homeschooling. There's no perfect curriculum. And if there were, there's no perfect learner. Every child is not going to learn everything you've tried to teach them. And so it's going to inevitably lead to gaps. I can remember I started preparing my kids for the gaps they were going to feel when they went to college, that they were going to feel when they went to college, because I had gone to a new high school in my city of Columbia, South Carolina. It was one of the best high schools in the state. There were 600 kids in my class. And I probably graduated in like the top 1 or 2%. And so I studied hard. I worked hard. And when I got to college, I'll never forget, when I walked into my first 3 classes, I was 450 pages behind because the syllabus, which wasn't ready for me until the day before, had us reading about 150 pages in each class before the first day of class. And I remember thinking, nobody prepared me for this. So I would tell my kids all the time, we're doing the best we can. We believe that this is what God has called us to, but you will feel gaps or experience gaps in what you know and need to know in various situations. And part of our job is just teaching our kids how to learn and how to navigate life. And so but I think it's really important to realize there will always be gaps. Another gap I had in my education was when I was in high school, they started this English 5 program. So I exempted English 4, which was British Lit, to go on to English 5. And then when I was at Furman, I was an English major, and they said there was a class I wanted to take. I think it was Puritan literature, which was like my favorite literature class I've ever taken. But they had to exempt me out of British Lit to get to that course, or whatever course it was I was taking. And so in high school and college, I missed British literature. And it was such a hole in my education that I'm still trying to make up for with my own independent reading, So that's a gap. And so anyway, I just want to put moms' minds at ease that wherever your kids would be in school, they're going to have gaps. And then we're going to talk more than just about academics in this program. There are also relationship gaps and spiritual gaps. But Nancy, first, I want you to share some of the stories that you've shared with me about gaps you faced with your girls when you were homeschooling.
There's always going to be a spot where you don't know how to fix a situation, you don't know how to overcome a challenge, and like I said, I would ask God. One of the ways that are so memorable to me that he showed up was both of my girls were struggling with math. By 2nd grade, like at the early ages, they both thought they weren't good at math. And we finally found a math curriculum that was working well and they enjoyed, but they had math trauma. And so they would sit at the table and it was like crying over math every day. And I just was like, Lord, what are we going to do about this? Because they have to learn math. So he reminded me that my daughters are very hands-on learners. They're creative, they're artists, and even as young girls. And so I got out a big dry erase board and I put it on a big easel and I wrote their math problems on the dry erase board. And now it's a tactile, like art experience. It's the same problem that's in the workbook that made them cry, but now using a dry erase marker on a dry erase board. And they're like, we got this. So that was a really fun moment where like the Lord just showed me, hey, just think outside the box and I will give you some ideas. So that was a really fun one. And then the other one that was really interesting to me was cursive writing. I got, the curriculum I wanted them to learn to write in cursive because I think it's an important skill. I think there's a hand-brain connection, things like that. We tried different workbooks. We tried doing it different ways. I would take 6 months off and then we'd bring out cursive writing again. And it was just painful and nobody was enjoying it. And so then I set it aside for a whole year. And finally I came back to it and I said, you know what? We're just going to write Bible verses in a cheap composition notebook. So each of the girls had one of those, 15-cent, 25-cent composition notebook. I would write a Bible verse in cursive on the dry erase board, and they would copy it into their notebook. And it was amazing to me how just that, and it might have been timing too. Sometimes I think we try to do things when they're not physically ready, emotionally ready, mentally, academically ready. And so sometimes you just need a break. You need a gap to wait for their hand to catch up, for their brain to catch up, for their willingness and interest.
That is such a great point, because in homeschooling, we can pay attention to readiness because we don't have 20 or 25 kids or 30 kids that we've got to keep, sort of in lockstep with each other because of classroom management. Right. And we can really focus on our child's readiness and their interests. And I think that, that's amazing. That helps a lot. When my boys were growing up, they were 7 and 9. They are 7 and 9 years older than our daughter Lizzie, and so we were. I wasn't even homeschooling Lizzie at this point, but we. I just felt like I was doing a terrible job with science, and I can remember hiring a science tutor, and they met with this tutor for like 6 weeks. And I said, I want you to go through these 3 science books. It was really 3 years of science, and pull out the main principles and make sure the boys understand it. So as we move forward, I feel like those gaps are taken care of. And it was really interesting because as this guy worked with them, he wasn't really in tune with their learning styles. Like Ty's an auditory learner, and if he doesn't talk about it, he's not going to respond to instruction. And so it was so funny. He said, Miss Tyler, have you been teaching your boys at the same time, the same thing? I said, yeah. And he said, from the things they know that are different from each other, you would never know they had been in the same classroom. Oh, wow. And so, it's interesting. It is interesting how our kids learn and internalize differently, and what they're and the way they express it is going to be different too. One of my favorite maybe goof ups as a homeschooling mom, I just kind of have to laugh at God's sovereignty at this one and thank him for preparing the kids anyway. The boys were it was the first time I had ever had the opportunity as a parent to have a class taught outside the home. When we were homeschooling in high school, it was before the days of the internet, and dual classes were just coming on board, and I wasn't comfortable with that prospect yet. And so we had this man who was a retired science teacher. He was a friend of mine who worked for us at Skays, and he was helping Debbie with their homeschool. And so he just decided to set up a class because he had been a science teacher. And my second son, John, loved science, and he wanted to be a doctor. And so science was key to him. Ty was a people person. We knew that he was going to make his living with his mouth, whether he was a preacher or a salesman. It would be his verbal skills that he used, and science was not important to him. So they were in the same science classes, but the level of importance I placed on it for John was much greater because he wanted to go to med school. And so the interesting thing for me was John becomes an attorney. After Ty graduates, he gets into medical device sales and has to fly to Boston or somewhere with his class of salespeople and take all these medical school level science courses. And so the kid that I thought would never do anything with science, here is his career is in science. And I remember Ty telling me the story about the instructor saying, well, the big boss called today and he asked me for the best student in the class. And he said, well, Ty, I told him you weren't the best student and you weren't the worst student, but you had the biggest heart and would make a great salesman.
Oh, that's so great.
So it's interesting how we create gaps that we don't even know we're creating. I thought I was making the best decision for the boys in science, not to stress Ty out with science, but make sure he had the credits he needed for college. And lo and behold, I mean, you just never know. But it's like you said, God just, God is waiting and active in blessing our kids and helping them get to be where He wants them in life.
So good. One of the things that you and I chatted about a little bit was the gap in that education experience that we had going to public school or private school, whatever, as kids. you know, Talking to moms and dads who are just getting started homeschooling, it always fascinated me that one of their biggest concerns was, well, my kid won't get to experience prom or sports or graduation ceremony or, those kind of things. And it's really interesting to me because it's amazing what you can find if you just look, especially today. There's so many opportunities. I think almost every state homeschool organization hosts a graduation ceremony. A lot of support groups do. You can have a cap and gown ceremony, and not just with your one student in your living room. And so it's amazing to me too to think about how parents are really innovators. And so, that proverb, necessity is the mother of invention, it's certainly true for homeschoolers. I think moms and dads are some of the most creative people when there is something that their child wants to learn or do or experience. We can either look around and see if something's available, or perhaps God's calling us to step out in faith and start something ourselves. Some of our favorite things, my girls did one little speech and debate class that wasn't for them, but they tried it. We did have a homeschool prom in our area that my girls weren't really interested in, but lots of homeschool teens went to. There were, theater, homeschool theater and arts programs and math clubs. We even did a homeschool bowling league at one of the local bowling centers.
That's fun.
Daytime classes or, leagues for homeschoolers. And we had a blast doing those things. So there's things that exist and there's things that we can create, but we don't have to miss out. And what I found was the opportunities that my kids had, I think, were greater than what they would have had in a school because it was so tailored to their interests and their needs.
That is so key, Nancy, because one of the things, there's so much educational efficiency in homeschooling because we don't have a classroom to worry about. We've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 kids, that we're trying to teach, but we can focus on their learning styles and their interest. And so as we do that, the learning takes on a new relevance for them and a new priority. And I really think that helps to close a lot of gaps in their lives. There's this quote from Bill Gates, of all people, founder of Microsoft, that I love. And this has been years ago that he said this. He said, American high schools have become obsolete in the way they face education. And it's time we set up a new set of 3 R's: rigor, relationship, and relevance.
Oh, that's so good.
And I thought that was so good because our relationships with our kids are so key. And as we're working with them and we love them and we know them, and we're implementing their interest into the way we teach them, then it becomes relevant. And we can implement the level of rigor they need in the areas they need for their callings in life.
It's so true. By the time my girls were probably 13, 14, I realized neither of them were going to go into something that required higher math. So we had made the decision that they could each go through Algebra 1, and it took one girl a year and a half, and the other, it took 2 years to finish Algebra 1. And then our younger daughter decided, I want to learn geometry. So she went to Barnes & Noble and bought herself a book, I can't remember what it was, but on how to learn geometry. And she just did that on her own. But I always anticipated that, like if we didn't do enough lab sciences or we didn't do enough higher math, that if they changed course from what I anticipated, they could fill in that gap at the community college. They could take classes that we didn't cover at home, perhaps. And so I was not really worried overly so about those missing areas that if they needed one day, they could fill them in some way.
You know, that is so interesting because that reminds me of Ty and John. So they didn't do dual enrollment, but they did after they graduated. They took a couple of classes the summer after each one of them graduated at a community college to get some hours and to get like composition out of the way, English composition, those types of things. And it was really interesting to me because I don't know why I was so worried about English composition, but they took it, they did really well. And then John had a teacher that was a Shakespeare expert that just happened, she had been out of job at a major university and happened to be at this community college. And so John took a Shakespeare class with her after that community writing course and just gave him in 6 weeks, it was an intense course, gave him this amazing, education in Shakespeare. So you're right. It's just amazing to see the way those gaps are filled. And another interesting thing is how homeschool kids grow up and help fill some of those gaps. I can remember,
sure.
I don't know why PE was such a thing before SCAES and before a lot of homeschool good laws got passed. Homeschool parents had to teach PE. And for a lot of moms, I mean, that was like the kiss of death. So Ty and John were both very good athletes. And they came home after a support group meeting one day. They ran up to their rooms. They were plotting. I mean, they didn't want me involved. I thought, what are these two up to? They're teenagers at this point, And so they come downstairs and they said, okay, Mom, we heard all the moms talking at support group today. They are so scared of teaching PE. They don't know what to do with their kids, how to teach them to throw a baseball, how to get them physically fit. They said, Mom, we know how to do that. So we've called and we've reserved a community center. We've talked to 2 of the homeschool moms in the group. We're going to teach a 6-week PE class. And so they decided how they were going to run it. They got 2 moms to be there every week. They charged like $5 a class. It was just enough to pay the community center. And then Tide had child evangelism fellowship training. And then John was very active, in Bible study and stuff too. So together, they would do a little Bible study and prayer time with the kids at the end of the PE class. And it was much cooler for these younger kids coming from these 2 teenage boys. And so, I just think that our kids witness us wanting to work with them, making mistakes, figuring out the answer together. And it teaches them how to be gap fillers in other people's lives. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does. That's amazing. I love what homeschooling can create, the atmosphere that exists, the opportunities. So I have 2 quick examples. One, when our older daughter Olivia was about 15, she came to James and I and said, I want to learn aerial, not like circus aerial, but like Cirque du Soleil. And we're like, well, that's not something Mom can teach in the living room. So what are we going to do about that? Well, she was 15. So James told her, well, you go do the research. You see if there's any classes nearby. Does something like that exist? And she found the Circus School of Arizona had a lady who was teaching that kind of aerial. And so it was one of those deals, you buy 13 weeks, you get the cheapest price. It was still super expensive. But we thought, this is something she's interested in. So we're going to support this. We paid for the 13 weeks. She thrived in it. And in the meantime, God was working in the background. The church that she took dance classes at, there was a Christian aerial troupe that needed rehearsal space. They offered free classes in aerial in exchange for rehearsal space. So then Olivia got to take these aerial classes in a Christian environment. She ended up teaching classes over time as she aged and developed skill. And it was just so neat to see, like, I couldn't have planned that. There's no way I could have found that solution. I couldn't have known that God was bringing that opportunity. at a much more affordable rate for us. And then the other fun thing for us was Alex, our youngest, she started horseback riding at about age 9. A tiny little girl. I mean, she was 5 feet and maybe 100 pounds fully grown, So at 9, she was just this little slip of a thing, but she was all about the horses. And so we found a place for her to take lessons, and she loved it. Well, over time, because we homeschooled and she was at the barn almost every day during the day, she was offered an apprenticeship. She got to be a groom and work with the horses in exchange for free lessons at one point. And then I think the barn that she was at lost a groom, and they hired her as a teenager. And I just love that. And some of her closest friends were some of these women, adult women, who were horseback riding enthusiasts. And it was neat that she had friends of all ages, and she was able to help the younger girls. And then she was mentored by these older women. And just, it's so neat to me how when God puts something in their heart that they're interested in, how he's already got a plan to meet that need. And sometimes we just have to step out in faith and say, okay.
Oh, those are such great stories, Nancy. Those are great stories. And you're right. I mean, I just remember my friend Deb Bell saying, Zan, God delights to bless our children. And I think we need to remember that God is for our homeschooling. I mean,
Yes.
we're seeking to train our children to love Him and to love their neighbors and to use their gifts for God's glory and their neighbors' good. And I think that's a model of education that God is blessing. So we just, it's like you said, we just sort of sit back in awe and see what God does for our children, sometimes through us and sometimes in spite of ourselves.
It's so true.
And so we are going to continue this discussion in the second part of this podcast. And then we are going to focus on things. Today we've been talking about academics and life skills a little bit. But in part 2, we're going to talk about gaps in relationship and gaps in faith, because those are things that are never addressed or rarely addressed in institutional educational settings. And to me, these are 2 areas where homeschooling really shines. So thank you so much for being with us today. And we hope you will stay tuned for part 2.